In the first 4 episodes of this series, we followed the historic Carpentersville to Yorkville trolley system, traveling by bicycle, automobile, and foot, from Carpentersville in North Kane County through West Dundee, next passing through the extensive street railway system of Elgin, then South Elgin, and the Fox River Trolley Museum, crossing over the river at 5 Islands, and finally passing through St. Charles. In Part 5 of this Fox River Trolley series, we will continue south, this time traveling through the historic county seat of Kane County, Geneva, Illinois, learning of its history and its remarkable role in the story of the Fox River Trolley system and the 3rd Rail Division of the Aurora Elgin and Chicago Railroad.
We continue our trolley journey heading south, down 3rd Avenue from St. Charles, as the road name transitions to Anderson Boulevard, today a quiet residential street. Here again, we see a wide avenue designed to accommodate streetcars. As in St. Charles, there were trolley stops at virtually every intersection: Union Street, Center Street, Stevens Street, and Peyton Street. Before arriving at Wheeler's Siding, located at the intersection of Anderson Boulevard and State Street, Illinois Route 38. The siding was so named as John Wheeler's coal and lumber yard stood nearby, to the south of State Street along 8th Street. As the street name implies, State Street was and is the main thoroughfare for municipal activities and commerce for the city of Geneva, the county seat for Kane County.
Like St. Charles to the north, Geneva was one of the first American colonist settlements along the Fox River, shortly after the forced removal of Native Americans following the Black Hawk War of 1832. Daniel Shaw Haight, about 30 years of age and reportedly of Dutch origin, was the first settler in Geneva, building a log cabin shanty located by a spring nearby the Fox River in 1833. Haight was followed by others, and in 1835 he sold out his claim to James and Charity Harrington, recent arrivals from Pennsylvania.
While Haight moved to Winnebago County to the northwest of Rockford, the Harringtons laid the foundation for what was to become Geneva in the ensuing decades. They had built a larger log cabin for their family and used Haight's cabin to create a general store. The Harringtons augmented the small store building with a large frame building in 1836, which also housed a tavern and U.S. post office. The post office had been established by Harrington in early 1836, using the name La Fox for the settlement.
By June of 1836, James Harrington then used his influence and wherewithal to have his La Fox settlement named as the county seat of Kane County, newly created in January of 1836 and named for Elias Kent Kane, Illinois' first Secretary of State. The Harringtons' tavern was used for the first county meetings, elections, and courthouse, and one of the first orders of business was to raise $3,000 for the construction of a county courthouse and jail, which was built the following year in 1837.
It was at about this same time that suggestions for a new town name arose, rather than La Fox, which perhaps sounded too exotic to attract serious investment. The name Geneva was suggested by Charles Volney Dyer, a 28-year-old Chicago physician originally from Vermont, and a successful dabbler in real estate, ostensibly in homage to the village of Geneva in upstate New York. And so it became. The town was formally surveyed and platted just a few years later, in 1838, by 35-year-old Mark Wentworth Fletcher, another Vermonter and early resident.
By 1840, Geneva consisted of a courthouse, a jail, a post office, 3 general stores, a furniture and coffin maker, 2 blacksmiths, 2 hotels, a tavern, along with a sprinkling of log cabins, frame houses, and stone buildings. A wooden bridge had been built across the Fox River, and a sawmill had been constructed on its eastern bank. The U.S. Post Office serving the community continued to be called La Fox long after the town adopted the Geneva moniker, however, as there was already a Geneva U.S. Post Office elsewhere in Illinois, to the west of Springfield in Morgan County. Not until this downstate village and post office went extinct was Geneva able to reconcile their town name, which did not happen until 1850, by which time the settlement had grown to more than 800 residents.
A big change came to the village shortly after, in 1853, when the fledgling Galena and Chicago Union Railroad created an additional branch westward to Dixon, Illinois, passing along Geneva's southern limit, beneath the aptly named South Street. This ancestor of the Chicago and Northwestern was a boon to the small community and triggered new industry. The first large factory in town was the Danford Reaper and Mower Works, which employed 50 to 100 men and produced about 500 reapers and harvesters every year. The first public school building was opened in 1855. A new and more substantial brick and stone courthouse building and jail were constructed in 1857 on 3rd Street. By then, 3 trains passed through the town daily, transporting the mail, passengers, and goods, and the town's population tipped towards 1,000 residents.
The 1860s saw more growth. A stone foundry was built along the west bank of the Fox River, to the north of the bridge, manufacturing smoothing irons, pickering pumps, and other domestic necessities. On the east bank of the river, the Bennett flour mill flourished, producing 130,000 bushels of flour per day at its peak. Other industries included a meatpacking company, flax mills, wagon shops, blacksmithies, almost a dozen dry goods stores, groceries, hardware stores, and a half-dozen churches. Now at about 1,500 residents, Geneva formally incorporated in 1867, naming Eben Danford as the first village president. 1 year later, in 1868, they built a much-needed 20-foot wide iron wagon bridge spanning the Fox River at a cost of $16,000, or about $1.2 million in 2025 money.
The early 1870s saw the creation of the Chicago and Northwestern Spur to St. Charles, which ran up along the west side of 7th Street, flanking the community's west side. A stone-built creamery producing butter and cheese was opened to the south of State Street along the west bank of the river in 1874. 6 years later, in 1880, a huge corn sugar factory opened to the north of the foundry. Geneva incorporated as a city in 1887, with James Harrington III, the son of James Harrington, elected as the first mayor.
It was just about this time when Geneva saw its next wave of population coming into the city, that being Swedish immigrants. Many of these newcomers were drawn to the rural river valley that reminded them of their home, and where they could find work in the local farms and in the factories and mills along the river.
In 1892, the Chicago and Northwestern built a new passenger depot at Geneva, replacing a wooden structure that had stood for decades. The new building was constructed just to the west of 3rd Street and to the north of the tracks, being built of brick with terracotta trimmings on the gables, 150 feet long by 30 feet wide. And it was much needed, as by now 21 passenger trains and 38 freight trains passed through Geneva each day.
The young city saw significant challenges as well. On the evening of March 13, 1890, The 1856 county courthouse burned to the ground, the fire originating in the steam pipes of the debtor's cell in the southwest corner of the building. Citizens stood by helpless as the great structure burned, since the city had no pressurized water and no fire brigade to combat the blaze. Miraculously, no one was injured in the fire, and at least some of the records survived, having been stored in protective vaults. A special committee was formed almost immediately to plan for a new courthouse building, which was completed and dedicated by the autumn of 1892, designed by Chicago architects Willoughby J. Edbrook and Franklin P. Burnham. To help mitigate against future fires, the city installed a water pumping station and water mains in 1896.
A worse calamity occurred just a few years after the courthouse blaze. During the afternoon of May 17, 1893, a large explosion ripped through the Pope glucose factory on the west bank of the river, killing 7 workers and injuring several others. The origin of the explosion was one of the large converters in the upper stories, a huge copper boiler 15 feet in length and 10 feet in diameter, under intense heat and pressure. Killed were Alfred Anderson, Victor Anderson, Charles Elmlund, Gustav Johnson, Andrew Kjellborg, Lars Schutz, and Alfred Strom, most of them being Swedish immigrants.
Here again is where our story turns to the Fox River Trolley system, built in the mid-1890s. Recall that in the spring of 1895, the management of the Elgin streetcar system and the Aurora streetcar systems thought to combine forces and sought to create an extensive trolley system along the Fox River, running from Carpentersville in the north to Yorkville in the south. They launched 2 new railway companies, one to extend south from Elgin and a second to extend north from Aurora, with plans to meet in the middle at Geneva. To address the northern segment, the Carpentersville, Elgin, and Aurora Railway was launched in the spring of 1895 and moved quickly to extend the trolley line to Carpentersville by mid-1895. 1 year later, as described in our St. Charles episode, they brought the railway line through South Elgin, Coleman, St. Charles, and finally into Geneva, running the first train from Elgin to Geneva in the early evening of June 30th, 1896, and beating the St. Charles franchise deadline of July 1st with just hours to spare.
When the first Elgin trolley car arrived at its Geneva terminus, just north of the Chicago and Northwestern Depot, filled with railroad management and local dignitaries, the company was met warmly by the 33-year-old Geneva mayor, Irving Leander Howell. But as time was short, there was little ceremony before the single car started back on its return journey to Elgin. Instead, citizens of both Geneva and St. Charles feted the car and applauded the newly minted railway as it passed confidently through their streets. Within a few weeks' time, trains started rolling regularly between Elgin and Geneva, and the new line, the northern segment of the Fox River Trolley system, already proved itself a success.
The southern segment of the Fox River Trolley system, at least the line that traversed from Aurora to Geneva, would prove to be a much more difficult challenge. The Aurora and Geneva Railway was incorporated in the first week of June 1896, just a few weeks prior to the successful completion of the Carpentersville, Elgin, and Aurora Railway. But well before they laid their first track, indeed shortly after the announcement of the Pan-Fox Valley Trolley System in the spring of 1895, a group of wealthy landowners along the west bank of the Fox River, between Batavia and Geneva, announced their intentions to oppose it. They filed a petition with the Kane County clerk in early June of 1895, specifically opposing the building of the railroad along Batavia Road, the street that linked Geneva and Batavia on the west bank, arguing that the tracks, poles, wires, and railroad cars would detract from the beauty of the area as well as pose a danger.
Despite this early resistance, the Aurora and Geneva Railway made no small plans and fully intended to be operating trains into Geneva by the close of 1896. With the franchise from the Kane County Board of Supervisors in hand, the new railway built northward, the overall project being managed by David A. Belden. A workforce of 50 men and horse teams descended upon the north edge of Aurora, along Lake Street, where it merged into Batavia Avenue, on the morning of August 3rd. At the same time, the Batavia City Council granted the railroad a franchise, with the conditions that the railroad complete the line to Batavia within 90 days, that they charge no more than a 15-cent fare to Aurora, about $5, and that cars would be used to transport passengers and packages only, with no freight cars allowed. Within 2 months, by the first week of October, the railroad had completed the grading, laying the ties and rails, setting the trolley poles, and the wiring for the first 2 miles of the route, and had trains running between Aurora and North Aurora.
Even more impressive, less than 3 weeks later, the railroad extension had completed the trackage and wiring infrastructure all the way to Batavia, another 2.5 miles to the north, running along Batavia Avenue. By the final week of October 1896, trains were running every hour from Aurora to Batavia, stopping just to the north of Wilson Street, in front of the Revere House Hotel, on the west side of Batavia Avenue, and beating the 90-day deadline set by the Batavia City Council.
Given their rapid progress, it appeared that the Aurora and Geneva would soon be knocking on Geneva's south door, linking up with the Carpentersville, Elgin, and Aurora, and creating one of the longest and finest trolley systems in the U.S. Midwest. But it is here where the young railway ran into serious trouble. The wealthy landowners between Geneva and Batavia had not gone away, and had in fact filed yet another petition of protest with the Kane County clerk, a month prior to the completion of the railway into Batavia.
The original plan of the railway was to continue north along Batavia Avenue, taking them directly past the Chicago and Northwestern Passenger Depot, where they would link up with the Carpentersville, Elgin, and Aurora, just 1 block north of the Geneva station. However, upon further review, they realized that a grade-level crossing at the Chicago and Northwestern Depot, with its multiple tracks and sidings, would be dangerous and also add significant delay to cars traveling north and south. The danger would be the result of the potential disruption of electric current to the trolley cars as they passed over the extensive rail yard, such that they might lose power and get stuck, potentially resulting in a catastrophic collision with passing trains. Further, as the Geneva, Chicago, and Northwestern Depot was a busy rail yard, streetcars would likely experience significant delays from passing passenger and freight trains. This realization, coupled with the opposition from the wealthy landowner group, who specifically denounced the use of Batavia Avenue, gave the Aurora and Geneva Railway serious pause.
While the northbound extension pondered its options, electric line passengers wishing to travel further north from Batavia or further south from Geneva were provided with a stagecoach line between the two terminals. The stagecoach would leave each station every half hour, carrying passengers for a 5-cent fare.
Geneva, for its part, had yet to grant a franchise to the electric railroad, and its blessing keyed around how the new railroad would make its way into the city from the south. It did not help that the Geneva City Council and mayor also had personal stakes, as well as alliances with landowners along its path. Nor did it help that just about everyone in the city had an opinion as to how this last mile should be resolved by the railroad.
The railroad sent surveyors out to have another look in January of 1897, which resulted in the Geneva and Aurora formally proposing a new route to the Geneva City Council in late February. The proposed route would travel along Batavia Avenue, then divert west, passing over the Chicago and Northwestern tracks via a bridge, and entering Geneva along 6th Street, heading north to Campbell, then east to the Kane County Courthouse, where it would link up with the CE&A. The city council flatly rejected this proposed route from the railroad, but they couldn't agree amongst themselves as to a better route.
With mounting frustration with Geneva's Gordian knot, another set of surveyors were brought in by the railroad to again examine northerly routes from Batavia into Geneva. By early April, David Belden was proposing yet another route. If the wealthy landowners did not want them coming in along Batavia Avenue, along their front yards, then the railroad had little choice but to come in through their backyards, along the river. And so Belden determined that the railway would instead leave Batavia Avenue about a mile south of Geneva, passing under the Chicago and Northwestern Batavia branch via a subway, then traveling along the west bank of the Fox River, through the backyards of Geneva's Good and Great, then turning west, passing beneath the Chicago and Northwestern a second time, and then entering Geneva from the south in the vicinity of 5th Street, then north to the courthouse.
Belden seems to have aligned his ducks in the Geneva City Council by this point, who voted to give the Aurora and Geneva a franchise in late April, although incoming Geneva Mayor, Dennis J. Hogan, who owned land along the proposed route, quibbled about the timing of the official signing of the new franchise by the outgoing mayor, Irving Howell, thereby questioning its legality. Belden then attempted to negotiate with the landowner faction to the south of Geneva in order to obtain the necessary right-of-way through their land. A few settled, but most did not, either refusing outright or demanding exorbitant land prices.
Belden's patience had run out by this point, and so he decided to pull out the big guns. In the first week of May, the Aurora and Geneva's attorneys filed condemnation suits in the Illinois Circuit Court condemning the right-of-way along the riverbank south of Geneva. This petition was based upon an 1875 U.S. Supreme Court ruling in the case of Cole versus the United States, which granted broad powers to the federal government in conjunction with mining interests, utility companies, and railroads for the right of eminent domain, with just compensation where benefits of public use could be demonstrated. Belden was confident of winning these petitions before the court and was predicting that trains would be running from Aurora to Geneva by the middle of 1897. So confident was he that he deployed a workforce to begin building the new route through North Batavia into Geneva Township, as well as along these strips of land that had already settled with the railroad.
But the final passage through the gates of Hercules into Geneva was anything but smooth sailing. There were about a dozen wealthy property owners involved in the condemnation suit, all of whom brought along their own legal counsel, some of the best and brightest in the Chicago area. The railroad's own case was taken up by the legal firm of Hopkins, Aldrich, and Thatcher of Aurora. And there were at least a few key legal points where the battle lines were to be drawn. First, did the electric railroad have standing in the right of eminent domain? The Aurora and Geneva Railroad was admittedly a street railroad, by definition running in or along streets. Did street railways fall within the umbrella of the right of eminent domain used by their steam counterparts? Second, was this indeed the best route into Geneva? The wealthy landowner faction argued that it made more sense for the railroad to travel along Batavia Avenue directly into the city, rather than diverting into private property, which is a rather ironic argument to make, as the landowners were on record for petitioning the county government to ban the railroad from using Batavia Avenue.
Not surprisingly, the case of Jenny D. Harvey versus the Aurora and Geneva Railway Company wound its way through the lower courts for the next few years, with rulings sometimes falling in favor of the railroad and sometimes favoring the property owners, ultimately being appealed to the Illinois Supreme Court in the autumn of 1898. These legal proceedings were watched with great interest by other street railroads throughout the country, as well as municipalities, as whatever the final outcome, it would likely set a legal precedent elsewhere in the nation. The Illinois Supreme Court finally rendered its opinion on February 17, 1899, ruling in favor of the Electric Street Railroad to leave the highway and to condemn the right-of-way through private property, when it was expedient or reasonably convenient to do so.
Was this the end of the story? Not quite. The proposed route into the city at this point continued to be along the Riverbank, turning west past Batavia Avenue, then passing beneath the Chicago and Northwestern trackage via a subway, entering into Geneva at about 5th Street, then turning west to 6th Street, then north to Campbell, where the route would turn east to the county courthouse. Allies of the landowners within the Geneva City Council then blocked the railroad from entering Geneva through an ordinance, contending that it was more valuable to the city if the railroad came in through the highway, Batavia Avenue, rather than along the riverbank. The case was then brought before the Illinois District Court in Chicago in mid-June, which once again ruled in the railroad's favor, declaring the new Geneva ordinances invalid.
There were to be 2 more logs rolled in front of the Aurora and Geneva before it could lay its final link to the CE&A terminal. First, a competing electric railroad was incorporated in late April of 1900, the Aurora, Batavia, and Geneva Railway, which proposed to run north from the east side of Aurora, up along the east bank of the Fox River, crossing over the Fox River via a new bridge just south of the Chicago and Northwestern Bridge, and then into Geneva. The timing of the announcement of this new railroad was highly suspect, and may have been intended to appeal to the courts yet again, perhaps suggesting that another railroad, which did not require eminent domain through Geneva, would better serve the public. The fact is that after making much noise as to their incorporation, and a presentation at the Geneva City Council, where they offered no substantive information regarding their proposed route, little or nothing was heard of this railroad thereafter.
The final obstacle was that of Dennis J. Hogan, the Geneva mayor in 1900. Hogan was one of the wealthy property owners who had long resisted the incursions of the Aurora and Geneva Railway. As a property owner, he was yet holding out and using his powers as Geneva's mayor to muddy the waters for the railway's entrance into the Forbidden City. Hogan's property lay along much of South Avenue, and the railroad would have to cross it in order to access the Carpentersville, Elgin, and Aurora line. Hogan and the railroad appeared to be at an impasse in the autumn of 1900, when the Geneva mayor suddenly and unexpectedly agreed to a substantially reduced valuation for his property.
Apparently, the railroad's attorneys, Hopkins, Hanchett, and Dolph, had closely examined Hogan's landholdings and deeds, discovering that streets had been laid out on his acreage when Geneva was first platted. However, these platted streets were subsequently not used and so vacated. The railroad's attorneys knew that under Illinois law, land previously platted as streets and subsequently vacated fell back under the ownership of the original property owners. And so they quietly approached the heirs of the previous owners and purchased the strips of vacated land on Hogan's estate. And in something of a legal masterstroke, when Hogan was presented with this revelation that his property had suddenly developed stripes, he swallowed hard and took far less than he had been previously demanding, thus removing the final barrier to the Fox River Electric Railroad.
However, it was a hollow final victory for David A. Belden, who had, up till now, worked so hard to connect the Aurora and Elgin segments of the Fox River Trolley system. While the railroad skirmished with Hogan and others, Belden managed to complete the line to the south limit of the city of Geneva, at the east edge of Batavia Road, just south of the C&NW tracks. The first trolley car from Aurora ran on this new track on September 1st, 1900. Passengers then had to walk a few blocks to the CE&A terminal along 3rd Street to continue their journey north on the Elgin trolley line. Belden was by now within a stone's throw of the CE&A line and had work crews digging a subway beneath the Chicago and Northwestern line, just a few blocks west of the C&NW depot.
But just 1 month after Hogan had finally settled with the Aurora and Geneva, the Carpentersville, Elgin, and Aurora Street Railway, passed into the hands of the Cleveland Syndicate, headed by Leopold J. Wolfe, the syndicate which ultimately created the Aurora Elgin and Chicago Railroad. Wolfe would have also been in negotiations to purchase the Aurora Street Railway system, including the Aurora and Geneva Railway. Belden would assuredly have known about these developments, but continued to press on with the subway near 5th Street, the final piece of the puzzle.
But in the spring of 1901, just as the Cleveland Syndicate purchased the Aurora streetcar lines, including the Aurora and Geneva, Wolfe put a stop to Belden's 5th Street subway. Instead, Wolfe proposed a new entry into Geneva, although unsightly, likely more expedient. From the CE&A terminus along South 3rd Street, passing east along a private road to 1st Street, then under the Chicago Northwestern tracks by repurposing a wagon viaduct near the river, then bending west again along Railroad Street and Bridge Street to Batavia Avenue. With this change to the route, Wolfe negotiated a new 20-year franchise with the Geneva City Council, the franchise being granted by ordinance in May of 1901.
The construction of the viaduct and the somewhat tortuous new path between the Elgin and Aurora terminals via 1st Street was completed by early June. Although expedient, the repurposing of the Wagon Road Viaduct and its hairpin turns did have serious drawbacks. For example, trolley cars were required to come to a full stop when approaching this viaduct, and the conductor had to jump off and run ahead of the car to ensure that there were no collisions with teams of horses and wagons.
After all was said and done regarding the tortuous path of the Aurora and Geneva into the heart of Geneva, what became of the actors in this ill-fated play? David A. Belden, who came within a few hundred feet of completing the final link-up of the Fox River Trolley system, was dismissed, along with other Fox River Trolley managers, by AE&C President Leopold J. Wolfe, within a few months of the takeover by the Cleveland Syndicate. Unruffled, Belden went east and eventually became the president of the Massachusetts Northeastern Street Railway, later vice president and general manager of the American Commonwealth Power Corporation, an electric utility.
And what of the other combatants, the landowners and politicians, who blocked the railroad every step of the way? Jenny Dow Harvey, one of the landowners whose name was prominently attached to the precedent-setting legal case, sadly died on May 11, 1904, at the age of 38, as a result of typhoid fever, shortly after the birth of her 5th child. Ironically, her husband, William P. Harvey, was a purchasing agent for the Aurora, Elgin, and Chicago Railroad. William Harvey sold the riverfront property to the Fabians in 1907. Dennis J. Hogan, former Geneva mayor, died suddenly on October 27, 1907, at the age of 50, shortly after engaging in a legal dispute with the city of Geneva regarding the property lines of his estate along South Street.
Back on State Street and Anderson Boulevard, the trolley line then went east. Here again, there were stops at most of the major streets within Geneva. In a short distance, the trolley had a grade level crossing with the St. Charles Spur of the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. This line ran along the west side of 7th Street and also served multiple industrial sidings to the west and north of town.
Just adjacent to the 4th Street switch was the Fargo Theater, today the Geneva Theater, on the north side of State Street, to our left. This theater was built in 1924 and would have been a popular stop along the Geneva route.
Soon after, we passed over the 4th Street switch, used to enable cars to either travel east, heading out onto the Geneva Spur of the AE&C towards Wheaton and Chicago, or to turn south onto 3rd Street as part of the Fox River Trolley system.
The route then turned south onto 3rd Street. Where the first stop heading south would have been James Street. This was the primary stop for the 1892 Kane County Courthouse, and always saw a steady stream of passenger traffic. Fronting the courthouse is the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, dedicated in 1915, and which honored Kane County veterans.
Next, we pass the Campbell Street stop, which also served the courthouse. And then the Franklin Street stop, which served retail shops and restaurants. At the southwest corner of Fulton Street, Kate Rafferty opened the Little Traveler store in 1924. It's still a popular and unique retail destination to this day. We then passed the South Street stop. A few hundred feet south of South Street, the trolley line made a hard left heading east down a small private road, directly south of the Preservation Cafe and directly through the Yoga 6 building. Just to the south of the private road, about where the Burning Leaf cigar store and Burger Local restaurant stand, was located the Geneva Car Barn, originally built by the Carpentersville, Elgin, and Aurora Railroad, which served into the early 1920s. Travelers could have alighted here at this turn to exchange with the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, the depot standing just a few hundred feet to the south.
Trolley cars would then have traveled about 600 feet east on this private road, which was part of Leopold Wolf's solution to the Geneva access problem. Today, much of this route is contained within a parking lot. The trolley line then made a hard right, heading south, on 1st Street, passing under the Chicago and Northwestern Viaduct. This was once a viaduct used by wagons before Wolf repurposed it for the trolley system. The 1st Street overpass we see today was constructed about a decade after the construction of the original trolley line. Built in 1912 by the American Bridge Company, the bridge was of pony plate girder design, with a 56-foot span and 2 masonry abutments.
The trolley line then made another right, traveling west by southwest, along what was then Bridge Street, and today a continuation of 1st Street, until it again reached 3rd Street, or Batavia Avenue, with the Chicago and Northwestern Depot just 400 feet to the north. In 1960, after 68 years of service, the elegant Victorian brick Chicago and Northwestern Depot building was replaced with a much more utilitarian red brick ranch-style building, 60 feet long by 26 feet wide. The old depot was taken down later that year. Today, the present metro station, built in 1985, sees more than 45 commuter trains pass through each day and stands very close to the original location of the Chicago and Northwestern Passenger Depot, a continuation of purpose stretching back to the early 1850s.
By 1900, Geneva's population had reached 2,400 residents, many of whom spoke Swedish as their primary language. And it was at about this time that Geneva saw its second significant immigration wave, this time from Italy, with immigrants again drawn to the work in the many factories that line the Fox River near Geneva.
Meanwhile, at the higher end of the economic ladder, Other new arrivals to the area included George and Nell Fabyan, a wealthy couple from Massachusetts and Wisconsin, respectively. They established the Riverbank Villa and Park in 1905, ultimately expanding it to 350 acres on both the east and west banks of the Fox River. They dotted their scenic landscape with zoos, windmills, lighthouses, greenhouses, boathouses, sculptures, a Japanese garden, and other formal gardens. After the Fabians passed away in the 1930s, the Kane County Forest Preserve District purchased the property from the estate and have since turned it into a popular destination.
The story of the Geneva Spur of the Aurora Elgin and Chicago Railway belongs with our other video documentaries on this topic. However, there are a few points of intersection and interest that are relevant to the story of the Fox River Trolley, such as Geneva's State Street Bridge, which provided the means by which the trolley system interconnected with the AE&C Interurban. When the Chicago, Wheaton, and Western Railroad was launched in the latter half of 1908, they desired a 50-year franchise from Geneva, but Geneva would not tender that privilege cheaply, and required that the railroad build them a new State Street Bridge, or pay for most of it. This triggered the Wheaton and Western to begin entertaining an alternative route through St. Charles. However, by the spring of 1909, the railroad ultimately agreed to route through Geneva, including the building of a new State Street Bridge.
Work on the new bridge was begun in June of 1909, with a design calling for 6 arches, sidewalks, a width of 50 feet, and a span of 430 feet. Work progressed fairly rapidly, and by December 1st, the bridge was all but complete, and the first trains were running between Geneva and Pleasant Hill, on their way into Wheaton and Chicago. The State Street Bridge we see today is not the 1909 bridge built by the AE&C, although it is very similar in design. Instead, this bridge was rebuilt in 1992 at a cost of $3.25 million by the Illinois Department of Transportation.
The Fox River Trolley system saw good business in Geneva for a few decades, but as elsewhere along the Fox River, ridership fell off in the late 1920s and 1930s, punctuated by the impact of the Great Depression. The Fox River Trolley system closed down by 1935, but electric cars continued to roll along Geneva's State Street for a few years more, as the Geneva line of the CA&E was still in operation. However, as this branch too saw a decline in ridership, it soon befell the same fate as the Fox River Trolley, and was closed down on October 31st, 1937. Geneva, meanwhile, continued to grow, its population doubling to 5,000 by 1950, doubling again to 10,000 by 1980, and yet again to more than 21,000 by 2010. Its city outline has seen the addition of many new subdivisions, neighborhoods, and schools to reflect this growth. Today, among many fine attributes, Geneva is known for its charming downtown, its pedestrian-friendly 3rd Avenue shopping district, the Kane County Cougars, a professional baseball team to the southeast of town, and its annual Midsummer Swedish Day Festival, a reverberating reminder of its Swedish heritage.
Back to the Batavia Avenue trolley stop at Batavia Avenue and 1st Street. The trolley line left the road here, departing from Batavia Avenue, passing slightly downgrade, southeast towards the Fox River for about 1/3 of a mile. We'll use the drone to follow the trolley line path. Today, this area is dominated by the Kane County Government Center building complex. In 1925, a portion of this property was used to build the Sacred Heart Seminary Shrine, also known as the Geneva Grotto, which still stands within the Gunnar Anderson Forest Preserve, which makes up the wooded area to the south and east of the county complex. As the trolley line approached the river, it turned south, following the riverbank, about 50 feet or so off the river edge. The Fox Ford stop, number 34, was located near this bend.
This riverbank was the segment that so vexed the Aurora and Geneva Railroad, curtailing its northward march, leaving it adrift in the Illinois court system. After passing over several tracts of private property, we pick up the former path of the trolley system about 500 feet north of the paved trails in Fabyan Forest Preserve, where what is today an overgrown gravel path.
About where we emerged out of the forest onto the paved path was the Jones Crossing stop, number 33, for the Isle of View Island in the middle of the Fox. Several hundred feet further brings us to the boathouse stop, number 32, where stands the Riverbank Villa Station, a relic of the trolley days. The station served both the Fabyan Villa a few hundred feet to the west, as well as the Fabyan Boathouse, where watercraft was launched onto the Fox River. This unassuming station building of Oriental design, echoing the Fabyan's nearby Japanese garden, may be the only remaining in situ and purpose-built station building from the original Fox River Trolley system. Another 1,000 feet brings us to Fabyan's greenhouse stop, number 31. And this is about where the trolley line began to divert back to the highway, back to Batavia Road, by heading southwest. On its way, it passed beneath the Chicago and northwestern Batavia Spur via a subway, long since removed, about where the Forest Preserve Trail passes beneath the Fabyan Parkway Bridge, built in 1976. The line continued a few hundred feet further southwest, where it met up with Batavia Avenue, today Lincoln Highway. Which brings us to the end of this segment, into the northern limits of Batavia, which is a story for the next episode.
As always, many thanks to our Be Historic channel community, our subscribers, our Super Thanks contributors, and our generous Patreon supporters. If you're enjoying these videos, please remember to like, subscribe, comment, and share. And if you're so inclined, consider supporting our channel via Patreon. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you, in a manner of speaking, in our next video adventure.